Good afternoon. I'm Dan DeLuce with NBC News, and I'm pleased to have Congressman Joaquin Castro today to talk about U.S. foreign policy and how it relates to domestic issues in the lives of Americans. Congressman Castro represents the 20th District in Texas. He's a graduate of Stanford and Harvard Law School. He is a member of the House Intelligence Committee, and he is vice chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, chairman of the House Foreign Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, and also is head of the U.S.-Japan caucus, which will be very apropos to our discussion today. So welcome to Congressman Castro.
Great to be with you and great to be with everybody from the National Security Project.
Well, I thought we'd start today's discussion with the fact that you're a candidate for the possible chairmanship of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. You are not the most senior ranking in terms of years in office in your fourth term, and you're seen as a progressive voice. So I thought it would be good to just start with what would you try to bring to that job, and maybe how you might do it differently than it's been done in the past. And one aspect of that job is there's a tradition, as you know, of bipartisanship. Even in this time, the ranking Republican, Congressman McCall and Congressman Engel, the outgoing chairman, had a cooperative relationship for the most part, I think most people would say. And there's also criticism of Congress that it's perhaps not sufficiently rigorous in its oversight when it's the same party on the Hill and in the White House. So just tell us a little bit about what you would like to bring to that job.
Yeah, no, well, thank you very much for the question. A few things. Well, let's start with the race itself and how I've approached it. The chair, whether it's foreign affairs or appropriations, energy and commerce, whatever it may be, for the folks that follow particular caucus races, they're usually very behind closed doors affairs. They're conversations ordinarily on the House floor, but obviously because of the pandemic, it's more phone calls now, member-to-member conversations. And so what I've tried to do in this race is establish a new standard of transparency and equity for the people who seek to be chair, hopefully not only of foreign affairs, but of any of the committees in the Congress, because although only the Democratic caucus members will get to vote next term on who the new chair will be, you all know the consequences for who becomes chair and that person's vision for the issues they want to take on and what they want to spotlight and so forth has tremendous consequences, not only for the Democratic caucus or the Congress, but really for the American people. And so in that spirit, I've tried to open this process up. I've done now more than half a dozen town halls just like this one with different groups. There's one probably about a month ago now, for example, where there were about 100 mostly progressive groups that were represented, and we did about an hour-long Q&A conversation, because I think that's what everybody in the public, that's what advocates, for example, who work on these issues full-time, I think that's what people deserve from somebody who seeks to be chair of a committee in the Congress, is to be able to ask them questions about what their vision is and where they want to take the committee. And then same thing with them. One thing that I've spoken to the Democratic caucus chair about, Hakeem Jeffries, is having a kind of forum where the candidates for foreign affairs, chair of foreign affairs, stand up there and take questions from the committee, from the congressional members about, again, those same issues, what their priorities are and where they want to take the committee. And so what I would do is you ask the question, well, what would you do differently, or how would you treat the committee? I think that what we have to do is use the committee to put diplomacy first. Look, I think all hoping for a Biden win in November. So hopefully we have a new president in January, and the legislative branch have to do two things simultaneously. Number one, stand up for its own constitutional authority, particularly when it comes to war powers. But at the same time, if Vice President Biden becomes president, work with the president to reestablish America as a North Star around the world on the things that we've stood for generations: freedom, democracy, human rights, rooting out corruption, the things that have earned us respect around the world. And the perception of America as a North Star has diminished incredibly over these 4 short years. And so I would do everything that I could to be a partner with the executive branch on that. For example, very quickly, we would organize a series of codels among the members of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the larger Congress to go out to our allies and let them know that essentially America is back, that we intend to be a North Star again on these things. I would also be more inclusive with the members of Congress in terms of the topics and the subjects that we take on with the committee, and the witnesses that we call in front of the witness table. I believe there are a lot of well-qualified folks whose expertise we drawn upon in Congress and called to the witness table, and I did work on that this term. So there are a lot of issues that we need to take on, obviously, but those are some of the important structural changes that I would make. And then, Ed, I think our focus should be on diplomacy first, on repealing the AUMFs, for example, reclaiming our constitutional powers, and that's going to be a very ambitious undertaking in the next year.
Thank you. I wanted to just follow up on running the committee. Would you see bipartisanship as also a priority or a tradition that you think needs to continue? Could you see doing markups of bills where there's not a consensus, where there's not a bipartisan consensus?
Yeah, that's a very important question. Since I got into Congress about 8 years ago now, I've had the fortune of serving on 3 committees that were fairly bipartisan. The last one I mentioned, kind of went downward, but Armed Services Force and then the Intelligence Committee, obviously around the time of the Russia investigation, that went sideways. First 2 in particular have been very bipartisan, and I think that's been generally a good thing for the United States and for the Congress. I do think that there's an important distinction to make between bipartisanship and consensus versus unanimity. I certainly believe that we should encourage bipartisanship, that we should even encourage consensus. But the standard that won't hold the committee to is absolute unanimity, where one Republican or 1 or 2 conservatives essentially have a veto power over the policies that we want to pursue. Now, I say that as somebody who has worked with Mike McCall, who's the ranking member on Foreign Affairs now, on cybersecurity issues. I was able a few years ago to get an important piece of legislation that I had rolled into his cybersecurity bill. I worked with Representative Curtis this term on Hong legislation, for example. I even worked earlier this term, before he went to the White House, with Mark Meadows, who was the head of the Tea Party, the Freedom Caucus, on global democracy legislation. So I've done bipartisan work. At the same time, we can't give any 1 or 2 members of the committee a veto over every single thing that we might consider doing.
You talked about the idea of, if Biden wins the election, that America is back, that would be kind of an effort to put that message out. But that does beg a question. Do you see what comes next? Is if Biden is elected, is it essentially a restoration of many of the policies that were pursued under President Obama? Or do you favor a more fresh approach, a more of a break with the past, not just with the Obama years, but even before that? And that, do you see a kind of more progressive vision where U.S. military commitments are changed or scaled back? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it has to be a fresh start. I think it has to be where we've learned lessons from mistakes that we've made in the past, that we're willing to make sometimes significant changes and adjustments based on what we've learned in the past. And to answer your question, it's not a matter of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. We have to be willing to do something different. Now, let me, I guess, go back a little bit and give some context to that answer. I think in the immediate aftermath of the election, which I'm hoping for a clear Biden victory so that there's no election contest, no shenanigans, anything from the president, that hope may be beyond really, what's reasonable at this point. But certainly that's what we're working for and hoping for. But let's assume first that Joe Biden is installed as president on January 20th of next year. What the executive branch is going to have to do, working with the legislative branch, is first, I think, a damage assessment of the exact damage that has been done by the administration at the State Department, where morale is near an all-time low, getting tougher, where less people are taking the Foreign Service exam, where diversity continues to be incredibly lackluster. Damage assessment of what's happened over the last 4 years. At the same time, lessons learned about what we learned Obama years and even before that, and what we would do differently. And I believe that the folks who are close to President Biden, many of whom experienced or served during the Obama-Biden years, themselves have their own sense of what we need to do differently. So I would like to work with the new president and the administration on a place where we put diplomacy first, and where military use of force is not our first instinct. President Trump, for example, pitched himself as somebody who was going to end the forever wars. At the same time, just recently we had more troops deployed than the beginning of President Trump's term. So we really have to dig in and figure out how we're going to do things so that diplomacy rather than the military is our first option.
That's a great jumping off point. Let's talk about how that works in practice with a few examples. So, for example, in Iraq, should the U.S. have troops in Iraq, or is it time to withdraw them because the threat from Islamic State has diminished? Should the U.S. have the small force that it does have in Syria? There are arguments that both Obama and Trump have ceded ground to Russia or other adversaries. So let's start with that. Is that a place where would that be?
Well, sure. And why don't we start with a very concrete example and something that I supported. There was an amendment that Ilhan Omar had last NDAA, for example. Two important amendments, actually, but one of them was hers. I'm trying to remember if it was a part of NDAA or a standalone piece of legislation, but I think it was an amendment to accomplish a drawdown next year, I believe, in Afghanistan, right? And so I supported her legislation, on that. And that's consistent with what I believe is that, for example, there was a declaration that ISIS had been defeated in Iraq. And so we have to fundamentally ask ourselves what is our continuing purpose in that nation? And same thing with Syria. During President Trump's administration, I think, have gotten even more chaotic there. But we have to fundamentally ask ourselves, what is the role of the United States in these nations, and whether our presence is really contributing to the good of the country and also to the stability of the United States and its allies. And so, that's have to figure out early on in the Biden administration.
What about using the threat of U.S. military force? That has also been a kind of bipartisan tradition, whether it's in discussions in diplomacy with North Korea regarding their weapons programs, or Iran. The threat of force has always been looming over U.S. discussions with Iran, even before Trump entered office. Is that something that should continue? Is that the way the U.S. should conduct itself?
Well, I think with Iran, for example, first of all, I think we should get back into the Iran nuclear agreement. And our objectives have to be clear. And we shouldn't be, earlier, for example, maybe in the last few months, that I don't want us to kick ass just to kick ass. And that would be the same thing with threats of use of military force. Now, look, I think the world understands that the United States has the strongest military of any nation in the world. And so that said, when we threaten to use our military, we have to have a clear reason why we're doing that. We have to understand what the end goal is. And I also think that President Trump, for example, who's been especially careless with threats of military force, if you'll remember, for example, early on within the last, or actually early on in his term, he basically got into a Twitter fight with Kim Jong-un where he was threatening military force on Twitter, basically. And I think that's obviously the completely wrong approach. And also this huge display of this idea that the United States was going to wipe North Korea off the map, which essentially what the president threatening or implying. I don't think that that's very helpful. And I also think it undercuts our diplomatic effort at that point.
I should mention for our audience that we are taking questions. Please look at the Q&A tab under the viewer box, and please offer any questions that you'd like. And maybe you can identify who you're with as well when you do that. On that theme that you were just talking about, I suppose we then should talk about China, because you mentioned North Korea, and China is considered a key factor in trying to contain North Korea, to try to curtail North Korea's missile and nuclear programs. And there's huge concern about China as now a real threat to the U.S. There's this bipartisan consensus almost now, as you know, that China needs to be treated differently than in the past, that it's a serious adversary and competitor. Where does the U.S. draw the line with China, and where does it need cooperate? And is it possible to seek cooperation with China on something like North Korea or climate change, and at the same time confront China in a pretty aggressive way, whether it's on disinformation or intellectual property theft or access to their market?
Well, I think that, question, you've made a wonderful and important point, which is that we have this very ironic, oftentimes conflicting relationship with China, our largest trading partner. But China can be very helpful to us and the world in working on climate change, remaining in a way North Korea. And so to answer your question, I think it's imperative that we work with China on these issues. I think what the Congress has failed to do, and this administration has failed, is to draw an important distinction that will help guide our behavior. And that distinction is what it means for China to fairly compete versus what it means for China to cheat. And that important, I say exercise, but exercise seems kind of light compared to the importance of this. That's an important distinction that the new administration and the Congress, I think, has to really think about. And I think that will ultimately guide our behavior with China. We don't want another Cold War with China. We want to be able to cooperate with them when it benefits. We, I think, want to be able to allow them to compete fairly, but also call them out when they cheat. So, for example, something that I have said and actually been asked about is that the Foreign Affairs Committee in this term has not had a full committee that is devoted exclusively with the full spotlight of the committee to what China is doing to the Uyghur Muslims in China. And that to me is a must for the legislative branch. We've got to go through these important paces diplomatically of putting pressure on China and working with our allies also to put pressure on China to change its behavior before we try to skip other steps and either threaten military force or anything else. And we haven't gone important paces yet in doing that. But again, I think we got to make a distinction between what it means to compete and what it means for them to cheat.
Does on the human rights issues, whether it's the Uyghurs or Hong Kong, should the U.S. link progress on human rights to trade disputes and other issues that the U.S. has with China? Should it go that
yes,
far?
I think that we need to find a way to include it. Yes, I think that those issues are that important I think that there is a new consciousness and a consciousness about who the United States engages with in the world. For example, in text, you've seen a lot of members of Congress reevaluate the United States relationship with Saudi Arabia. Yes, I think that it's fair game to say that we need to take these things into consideration. Uh, in the United States, in its foreign policy, in its posture, in the awareness of the American people, we evolve ourselves. We become more conscientious about these things. The public demands more from trade agreements. In many ways, we've had a lot of that the last several years. But you asked the question of human rights, and specifically with respect to China. Yeah, I think that should be part of it.
And then what about the military sort of strategic security aspect of the China threat, should we call it? Should the U.S. military be pushing back or asserting the right of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea or in the East China Sea, for that matter? And also, how do you square that need to perhaps counter China with also a progressive priority to rein in the defense budget, the Pentagon's budget, and to readjust U.S. military's role in the world? Isn't there a concern among some Asian allies that a Democratic presidency, a Biden presidency, might mean less assertive U.S. military presence in the Pacific?
Well, I think that we can both stand up for our allies, the freedom of navigation. As you know, China has gotten more aggressive over the years in the South China Sea, around the Senkaku Islands, has had issues with some of the ASEAN nations. I think that we can stand up for our allies and also be smarter, and I think actually spend less money than we have on certain parts of our military budget. And here's what I mean by that. And somebody who served now over 4 years on the Intelligence Committee, I believe that some of our military spending at this point is misplaced. And let me tell you what I mean by that. We are in a race right now on technology that, if other countries are more successful or are successful, can render the very expensive equipment that we buy, whether it's ships or fighter jets, equipment that costs hundreds of millions of dollars, some of it over $1 billion, can render some of that useless on the pounding of a few keystrokes. And so what I'm saying is that we spend more of our money actually figuring out those things like quantum computing and artificial intelligence, and so that are in many ways defensive actions for us and for our allies. At this point, simply buying more equipment rather than fixing or addressing those issues next decade or even longer than that in particular could prove to be a disastrous mistake for the United States. And so I actually think that that we could do it smarter, that we spend our smarter than we do right now and still stand up for our allies.
What about, you'd mentioned technology. What about the idea of decoupling the U.S. economy, or at least decoupling certain sectors like the technology sector as much as possible from the Chinese economy? Is that a realistic and sensible policy proposal?
I'm sorry, you were breaking up. That's my line.
Just to say, on technology and China, do you support the idea of decoupling the tech sector or other economic sectors from the Chinese economy, the Chinese supply chain? You hear a lot of talk about decoupling. Do you support that idea? And is that a realistic policy goal?
I think that it's certainly something that we can examine, that we can take a look at. There certainly hasn't been a tremendous work yet that I've seen come to the Congress on it, but it's certainly something we can look at.
And then you talked about the State Department, and as you know, there's a lot of former diplomats who say that morale is very low in that Department, and was not particularly high even before Trump took office. The budget has been pretty flat now for a while. How do you rebuild that department if it needs rebuilding? How do you make it a more
The State
diverse
Department?
foreign service? Yes,
Okay.
and how do you make that workforce more diverse? Diversity has been a problem. And then I have another question: do you favor the idea of just getting rid of political appointed ambassadors, especially campaign donors who get rewarded with ambassadorships? Other countries really don't do that. Is it time to end that?
That's a great question. And and I apologize probably here because the walls of Congress, everything's so old and insulated and so forth. So it's breaking up a little bit, but let me try to answer. On the State Department, in terms of how we rebuild the State Department, there and how we make it first, there are several initiatives underway. So I chair the subcommittee on oversight and investigation. We met with all of the affinity groups. That was the first meeting that we had. We've had 2 meetings on improving diversity now. A few years ago, I sponsored legislation or authored legislation that made it into a larger bill during the Obama years, preserve the Rangel Pickering Fellows to bring in a more diverse class of diplomats. The State Department has now recently, in the last few months, that it's expanding that program. So that's the entry. Karen Bass has a bill that passed out of the committee today, we just voted on creating a mid-level career entry path for people to come into the State Department. We're also doing work around retention because you see a lot of people, people heading for the door need to figure out, and we're working on this, how do you keep people right? Now, I think, and again, this is editorializing, but I think that some of the exodus that we've seen over the last few years, because employees at the State Department have lost confidence in the Trump administration and don't want to be part of the Trump administration because it's so chaotic and because of the tone and because nobody can reasonably speak for the president because he goes off on tangents. But it's incumbent upon the Congress and the new president to work on all of these issues. And earlier this morning, we had a hearing on diversity in the intelligence community. It's a challenge there as well. So we're working on all of those issues and hopefully can make headway on that. But also, I believe we should do a new Foreign Service Act. There hasn't been a Foreign Service Act since 1980. It's been 40 years. We need to rebalance in Congress what I think leads to a preference for use of military force, or at least tends to draw through the military lens. And let me give you a specific example of what I mean. Every year in Congress, there's only a few bills that you'll hear members of Congress say are must-pass pieces of legislation. The budget or the appropriations process and the NDAA, which is one of them, the National Defense Authorization Act. But you never hear people state authorization or reauthorization act is a must-pass bill, or even an Intel Authorization Act. Now, the Intel Authorization Act has been passed fairly consistently, but what happens is of foreign affairs, because we don't often pass state reauthorization, any important piece of legislation, or many of them, will often get rolled into the NDAA. What that means is that you're taking a piece of foreign affairs legislation and running it through the armed services lens. And there is a cost to that in terms of the balancing of your military versus your diplomacy. One real quick last example on this, because I do serve on the Intelligence Committee. I noticed when I came to the Intelligence Committee in 2016 that there were ex officio seats for the chairman of the Armed Services Committee and the chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense Operations. But there's no ex officio seat for the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. So to me, that's an example of how the Congress, the legislative branch, is prioritizing, again, a military response and even military awareness or defense awareness of intelligence over the diplomatic response and a diplomat's awareness of intelligence. That leads, I think, in Congress to the imbalance that moves towards armed services.
Interesting. On military as maybe the default tool in U.S. foreign policy, often I should ask you, as someone who's seen as a progressive, when should the U.S. use military force, and does that include circumstances where there is a civilian population facing potential genocide? Uh, and should the Pentagon's budget reflect the idea that the U.S. military must be superior to all its adversaries, the primacy of the U.S. military to be able to fight two simultaneous wars and so on? A lot of these conventions that have backed up that spending. Do you buy into that as well?
Well, you asked the question, when should we use military force? Obviously, if our nation is under, we're also part of treaty alliances, for example, to help protect us. But remember, there's also different instances where you're going to use the military, and different, I guess, modes. So, for example, what you've seen the Trump administration is go it alone, oftentimes, right? Rather than engage our allies and set around the responsibility for addressing military situations around the world. I think we have to be mindful and very cautious about the United States going it alone on these military challenges. And we have to work with our allies. And again, I mean, generally, as a philosophy, we have about how we're not just going to kick ass to kick ass, right? In terms of humanitarian situations, look, I think there's times over the years where we have seen genocidal actions, where I think military action was appropriate, right? Where we've seen populations that were extremely oppressed, where military action was appropriate. But I also think that that's a determination. That's a situation, again, where Congress has to be part of that decision, and we spectators to that decision, right? You need more voices, you need more heads coming together as part of the United States government, rather than just the president or the executive branch or a small team of militaries who are making that decision. And so that's why I'm saying that Congress has to reassert constitutional authority in these matters.
What about on that issue with this drone strikes, that these killings that are targeting suspected or alleged terrorists? That was carried out very aggressively under the Obama administration as well. And there are voices who have criticized that, saying this is essentially circumventing Congress, that it's basically U.S. military action that is not really getting any treatment in the check and balance system. Do you think that has to end, that when the U.S. goes and targets a suspected terrorist or an adversary with a lethal drone strike, that just can't be done without some kind of congressional authorization?
I think so. I think we need to move closer to that. Again, I can't discuss all of it because it is classified and I'm on the Intelligence Committee. But I do think, looking back over the last 4 years, I'll say this: there are times where I think that it has been done too freely, and Congress should have a stronger role in those determinations.
And then maybe this is also related to that, and I'm looking at a question that someone's offered up, and I remind everyone to ask a question if you'd like online. Just look at the Q&A tab under the viewer box. This is a question that I had as well, which is, you talked about the need to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Should that be based on certain conditions, including whether the Taliban commit to some kind of a democratic system involving elections and rights for women and so on and so forth?
Yeah, and if you look at what Ilhan tried to do, I mean, she was trying to accomplish certain things in that legislation. So I would call it a responsible exit. It wasn't just, okay, we're right away. It was a responsible exit. So yes, we would still have goals that we're trying to accomplish, But as you know, there was a peace process, and we were aiming to get to those goals. Part of the challenge with that, with the Trump administration, again, is that they tend to be a little bit cavalier, and it wasn't inclusive of all of the difference. So I think that we can actually get there.
And then we have a little bit of breaking news since last night that I wanted to ask you. The administration announced its decision on the ceiling for refugee admissions for the next fiscal year. And the number is 15,000, which is a historic low, as you know, even lower than the last ceiling, which was 18,000. What I am assuming you're not going to be a fan of this decision. What is happening on that issue? And do you think that it reflects the will of the American people? Has the Democratic Party or have human rights groups failed to explain why more refugees should be admitted into the country?
Well, first, I'm a big opponent of the decisions that the administration made with respect to refugees, not just this decision, but even going back a few years now. Look, the goal of Stephen Miller and President Trump, folks at the White House, is to keep people out, particularly to keep brown people out. Let's consider for a second where we are, the United States as a nation, with respect to the world right now. The United States, I believe, is as closed off as it's ever been in modern American history right now during this pandemic than we've been in the modern era. Let me tell you why I say that. Because many visas you can't get to come to the United States. Because unless it's changed recently, green cards were frozen. Naturalization ceremonies for a few months at least were frozen. So even people who all they had to do was ceremony and take an oath couldn't do it. Now, despite the backlog, these ceremonies are operating only at asylum seekers to this nation are being summarily expelled without any kind of due process. And so you think about how this president using the pandemic as an excuse. Now, don't I think many Americans, if you did that, temporarily, you said we're going to take 4 weeks or some period, we need to figure out what's going on with this virus. I think people would say, okay, it's now been 6 months or more actually, and there's no intention by this president, it seems like, to change it. And in fact, I would argue if President Trump is reelected, it's only going to get worse. And these new restrictions that have been placed on people are being made permanent, some of them. And so look, I think all of us can do a better job of communicating with our fellow Americans why being a place to seek refuge is important and has been important throughout the generations. And remember, generations, people coming from Europe, from Latin America, from other places around the world, the reason they were coming to the United States was for some kind of refuge. And that need continues today. There are 80 million people right now in the world who are displaced from their homes. And so we need to get back to a place where refugee cap, Zoe Lofgren, for example, with the GRACE Act, proposes moving that cap up to 95,000. During the Obama years, I believe at one point it was 100,000. So I'm an advocate for getting us back. I've had many conversations with Catholic Relief Services, for example, and that's the irony, is that it's actually some of the more conservative groups and religious organizations that help settle refugees to the United States. Got to get that number back up. We've got to, again, be a place of refuge for the oppressed and vulnerable people.
Thank you. I'm going to read a question from a member of our online audience. Mark Hand is asking, in this week's presidential debate, he put that in quotes, debate, Biden mentioned Russia's placing bounties on U.S. soldiers' heads. What range of options would you suggest that a possible future President Biden consider in response to that? And do you think that there would be pressure to show strength right in the early days of his administration if he's elected?
That's a great question, and it's a realistic question that the new administration is going to have to confront. But let's start from a very basic level and then go from there. The first thing Vice President Biden in January can do is say something about it. President Trump has hardly uttered a word about it. It doesn't seem like it's affected his relationship, his dealings with Vladimir Putin at all. First thing the president can do and should do is actually stand up to Vladimir Putin and let him know very strongly and very sternly that the United States is not going to accept that. Uh, it's a basic thing, and it is. But consider the fact that the current president has not even done that. Uh, in foreign affairs, actually, one of the other folks that's running for chair of foreign affairs, Greg Meeks, had a bill that will allow Russia from joining the G7, right? And so we're going to have to go through first, I think, different paces of diplomatic options about how we confront Russia. But look, it also speaks to, in terms of military awareness of the threats, we have to be aware. The military has to be as prepared as possible. The Biden administration has to work with the military on making sure the military is prepared as possible to protect our service members. So we need to consider these diplomatic options. By the way, with respect to Russia, have to get a lot better at cybersecurity. I don't believe that we spent enough time buffeting our different systems, our critical infrastructure, and not only doing it ourselves, working with allies to help each other do the same thing. You know, I've spoken about the need for a cyber NATO. I know that NATO has a cyber component, but I also think that it's underdeveloped. That considering the threats to our critical infrastructure, the threats of election, not the threats, the reality interference, that we're nowhere near where we need to be in terms of our capabilities and our cyber alliances around the world.
I'm going to give you another question. You talked about Congress's role in authorizing military force and that needs to be restored. And you talked about an AUMF. If there was a new authorization for military force adopted in Congress, what would it look like? And what do you think the factors should be in that? And how would it look different than the one that was written?
Sure. Well, another great question. And let me start with this, and then what was asked. The Congress, the executive branch over the years, under different presidents, has, I think, tried to take powers from Congress in terms of declarations of use of military force. But there are also points in which I think the Congress has willfully acquiesced those to the executive branch. And I want to take you back to the summer of 2013, August specifically. The Syrian War, of course, came to the American consciousness in a big, and you remember the discussion over the red line and so forth. And there was a moment there where the Obama administration was trying to decide, okay, what is our response? And is it going to be a military response? If so, what is that military response going to look like? And I remember getting, I think, about 1,300 emails, outreach basically, within the span of about a week and a half, many of them from my district, folks from my district, San Antonio, which is known as Military City, USA. And most of those folks saying, don't do it. Don't get us committed to another war, anywhere in that region, right? Including the family members of service members who were reaching out in San Antonio. And so what the administration, the White House, figured out, look, this is me kind of estimating their minds. This is obviously a very controversial situation. If we're going to even consider, for example, putting on the ground, whatever we're going to do, we need Congress to be a partner in this and buy in. So the White House, as you recall, a draft AUMF to the Congress. And what happened to that draft AUMF? Nothing happened to the draft AUMF. Congress decided to willfully stay on the sidelines. And I don't mean that, hey, we should have put boots on the ground. What I'm saying is that you got to decide that Congress has to play an active role. If you say, we're not giving you any permission to do much of anything, right? If that's the position, or if we're going to give the executive branch authority to do a lot of things, right? Whatever it is, we need to be able to an active role and not just be spectators. Now to the issue of, well, what does that look like, right? But that's the process that we have to go through in the Congress. That's the process that the legislative branch needs to engage in, the Affairs Committee needs to engage in. The issue of when you can use military force, is it only when the United States or its allies are threatened? Is it in humanitarian situations? Is it just for terrorism now? And also where you can use that military force, all right? The 2001 AUMF that has been used to combat terrorism in different parts of the world was fairly broad and has been used in a very broad and vast way, I would argue. So how exactly do you rein that in? Do you rein it in geographically and contain it to a certain area? Or do you rein it in by function? And those are all things that we have to go through and make a decision on as a Congress.
Thank you. We have to end it there. I had more questions, but have to wait for another time. Thanks for your time, Congressman Castro, and thanks for the audience questions. And I will turn it over to the Truman Center. Thank you again.